Watch a snake for more than a few seconds, and you'll notice something strange. That tongue never stops. Flick, 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 even when nothing is happening, even when there's no threat, no prey, nothing to react to at all. Most people assume it's tasting the air, or maybe smelling for danger. Both of those ideas are close, but neither one is actually right, and the real explanation involves a sense organ humans don't even have. Let's start with what that tongue is actually doing, because it isn't tasting or smelling in the way we experience either of those senses. A snake's tongue has no taste buds and doesn't process scent directly. Instead, it works purely as a collection tool. Every flick pulls tiny airborne particles, molecules too small to see, out of the air and off nearby surfaces, and traps them on the moist forked tips of the tongue. The fork itself matters here, by splitting into two prongs. The tongue can sample scent particles from two slightly different points in space at once, left and right, which becomes important in just a moment. So if the tongue isn't tasting or smelling, what happens to everything it collects? This is where the story gets genuinely strange, because the tongue doesn't send that information to the nose at all. Once the tongue retracts into the mouth, it presses those collected particles directly against two small openings in the roof of the mouth, connected to an organ most people have never heard of. The vomeronasal organ, often called Jacobson's organ. This organ has its own dedicated set of nerves running straight to a specialized region of the brain built specifically to process chemical information. In other words, snakes have an entire sensory system, separate from taste and separate from smell, that exists purely to interpret these collected particles. Humans don't have a functioning version of this system at all. We rely on our nose and mouth for chemical detection. Snakes built an entirely separate, dedicated channel for it. Now here's where the two-pronged tongue becomes critical. Because each fork samples from a slightly different location, a snake can compare the concentration of scent particles between its left and right tip. If the left side picks up a stronger signal, the source is likely to the left. If the right side is stronger, it's likely to the right. This is functionally a form of directional tracking, similar in principle to how you can tell which direction a sound is coming from, because it reaches one ear microseconds before the other. Except a snake is doing this with scent in three-dimensional space, dozens of times a minute. This explains why the flicking never really stops, even in situations that look completely calm. A snake gathering directional scent data isn't just checking for danger occasionally. It's continuously building and updating a live chemical map of everything around it: prey trails, predator scent, territory markers left by other snakes, even the direction a potential mate might be located. Stopping that process, even briefly, means losing track of a constantly shifting picture. So the tongue keeps moving, almost like a radar dish that never powers down. Think about what this actually means for how a snake experiences its surroundings. We rely heavily on vision to understand where things are in relation to us. A snake is running a parallel system built on scent. And because of the forked tongue, that system carries genuine spatial information. Not just a general sense that something is nearby. It knows roughly which direction, and by comparing signal strength over repeated flicks, it can also get a rough sense of how far away. There's an environmental factor that makes this system even more effective. And it connects directly to something we've covered before on this channel. Moisture in the air and on surfaces helps chemical particles disperse more evenly and stay detectable for longer. That's part of why snake activity often increases noticeably after rain. Since the same wet conditions that surface prey like earthworms and amphibians also make it easier for a snake's tongue and organ system to track scent trails across greater distances. The tongue isn't just flicking more in those conditions because there's more to find. It's flicking into air that's actually easier to read. So how often is this actually happening? More than most people would guess, depending on the species and situation. A snake can flick its tongue several times per second during active tracking and even at rest. It typically continues at a slower, steady rhythm rather than stopping entirely. This constant baseline activity is part of why a snake's tongue almost never appears fully still in footage or in person. Even during moments that look completely uneventful. Here's a detail that surprises a lot of people once they understand this system. Tongue flicking isn't just about finding food or avoiding danger. It plays a role in nearly every major behavior a snake engages in during mating season. Males rely heavily on this same directional scent tracking ability to follow pheromone trails left by females, sometimes over surprisingly long distances. Newly hatched snakes use it almost immediately to identify their surroundings before their eyesight has fully matured. Even during the vulnerable pre-shed period we've discussed before, when a snake's vision becomes temporarily impaired, tongue flicking becomes even more important, since it's one of the only reliable sensory tools still functioning at full capacity while eyesight is compromised. This reframes something important about how snakes experience the world compared to how we assume they do. It's easy to project a human-centric view onto animal behavior, assuming vision must be the dominant sense for every creature since it's dominant for us. But for a snake, scent tracking through this dual-organ system is often doing more real-time work than its eyes are, in many situations, especially at night in dense brush, or during that temporary window of impaired vision before shedding. The tongue and vomeronasal organ aren't a backup system, they are the primary one. So what does this mean practically, the next time you happen to see a snake with its tongue flicking rapidly nearby? First, it's not a sign of aggression or agitation specifically. Rapid flicking simply means the snake is actively gathering directional information, which could be about you, about potential prey, or about something else entirely in the environment. It's data collection, not an emotional state. Second, this connects to something we've emphasized before about reading behavior rather than assuming intent. A snake tongue-flicking toward you isn't necessarily reacting with hostility. It's doing exactly what it does toward every part of its environment, building a scent-based picture of what's around it. And you simply happen to be part of that picture right now. Third, if you're trying to observe a snake safely from a distance, understand that it's very likely already aware of your general direction and rough distance well before you might expect, thanks to this system, even if it hasn't reacted visibly yet. This isn't a reason for alarm. It simply means the snake is processing your presence continuously, the same way it processes everything else nearby. And its next move will depend on the same distance and risk calculations we've covered in earlier videos, not on anything specific about the tongue flicking itself. Here's the bigger picture worth taking away. That constant, seemingly random flicking isn't nervous energy, and it isn't simple curiosity either. It's a sophisticated, continuously running sensory system, built around a sense organ humans don't possess, using a forked design that turns scent into directional information almost like a built-in compass. Every flick is a snake actively mapping the space around it in a dimension we can't perceive at all. So the next time you watch a snake's tongue flick in and out, again and again, without pause, you'll know it's not tasting and it's not smelling. At least not the way we understand either of those words. It's running one of the most specialized sensory systems in the animal kingdom, quietly building a picture of the world that has almost nothing to do with what it sees, and almost everything to do with what it's able to sense in a way we never will.